Welcome to the Startup Grind. Let me introduce Mike. Mike is a Mike is a founder. Mike is an entrepreneur. He's also been a senior executive at companies like Microsoft, Twitter, and Palm. He's an investor in a number of companies, including Cloudera, Gumroad, Code Academy. He's currently a partner at Kleiner Perkins. Let's give a big, warm Startup Grind welcome for Mike Abbott. Here we go.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, welcome. It was like a lot of build-up there.
Yeah, a lot of pressure.
A lot of pressure. Well, hey, can you guys hear okay? You hear Mike's? Can you hear Mike's mic all right in the back?
Can you hear me?
You guys okay? Okay, great.
We're good? Okay, good.
We love to start these interviews by just learning a little bit about yourself. Tell us about where you grew up. Tell us about your grandfather and your father and what they did for work.
Okay, life story. So I grew up in the Bay Area, which is, I think, a little bit unusual now. I grew up on the edge of San Jose and Saratoga. I was fortunately, now I can say this, raised by a dad who was an engineer. My grandfather was an engineer. He actually taught at Berkeley. So for me, what that meant was I always grew up around computers. We used to go to the flea market at De Anza on Saturday mornings, not Sunday, because I think that's the normal flea market, but this was like the computer market. And our first computer was an Apple II Plus. So I taught myself BASIC as well as then Pascal, kind of growing up.
And what did your grandfather teach?
Electrical engineering.
Electrical engineering,
Yeah.
And tell us about, so you had computers in your home at an early age. Tell us about this experience you had with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak.
So I was in, I don't even know, this was the third or fourth grade. And growing up in the South Bay, Apple Computer actually had donated a lot of computers to the schools there. So for me, it just felt normal that there was a computer at home and a computer at school. Well, predominantly what my friends and I did were actually break the security codes of games and trade games.
Yeah.
But for some reason, a friend of mine and I wrote a small little grading program for my teacher. And at some point, Steve came by to visit Blue Hills Elementary School in Saratoga and got to meet these two guys. And they seemed like really nice guys. And I think this friend of mine, Toad, and I were just more impressed that, wow, maybe we can actually do computing and actually make a living out of it. And I remember coming home and telling my dad that I met Steve Jobs, and I think he was more shocked than I was because I really didn't. I didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
I just got a cool Apple sticker at the time. So
You still have it, or?
No, I think my mom, I'm sure, cleared it out from our house, but I wish I would have kept it.
So was the expectation you come in with this background with your dad working at Lockheed, your grandfather, an engineering professor? Was it this expectation that, hey, you're going to do engineering, or was that kind of naturally ingrained in you, or where did that come from?
No, actually, it was kind of more random, just because I was just always around it, either on the computer or doing Heath kits. And actually, as I got into high school, became more interested in science. I actually studied biochemistry as an undergrad. I was really interested in looking at how I could potentially apply computing to biology, which at the time was just kind of a glimmer of light way in the future.
Yeah. And were you doing entrepreneurial things growing up, or was this something that
I could actually no. I mean, I don't have some story of like I was selling products outside my door when I was a kid. I didn't actually. My path, as we kind of will talk probably a little more about, is pretty unique. I think I was always one where I was really scrappy, and I would go figure things out, whether it was teaching myself BASIC or Pascal, or later in my career just jumping into brand new domains. But there wasn't some like big predetermined path. And I mean, as a matter of fact, even after my undergrad, actually I did an internship here at SRI in Menlo Park, where I did research on human livers. And I got real interested in primary research and actually always coming back to informatics. So like the one thing I kind of, for me, always came back to computers. That was like my comfort food.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, like I can do that. I'm interested in these other areas, and how could I find these intersection of domains? And I mean, that's kind of been the story of my exploration in my career, I think.
So you start here in California in school studying biochemistry, and then you end up at the University of Washington. Is that
yeah,
right?
so I had this idea that I think I may want to teach, or I'm going to be really good at science. And so I go up there, and not quite before my second year, I kind of had two epiphanies. One, I didn't really want to write grants for the rest of my life and be a professor. And then secondly, I just really came to the realization I was much better at math and computer science than I was at just doing primary research in science. What helped kind of have me come to that conclusion was a friend of mine had got a grant at SRI to spin a company out of SRI. And so I came back. I told my advisor, I'll be back. I'm just going to try this startup thing. And, lo and behold, I never finished.
Yeah. So talk
much to the chagrin of my parents.
So and this is composite, right?
No, actually, this is a company called GeneTrace.
Okay.
A friend of mine had developed a technology to use a mass spectrometer to do high throughput DNA sequencing, and I was doing the informatics work.
Wow. Okay.
And that's what kind of really started focusing a lot of my time, frankly, just on computer science.
Yeah. And what happened to that? Did that eventually, was that a short thing, or was it
the company never took any venture. This is actually interesting for me now, especially my current role. We never took any venture financing. We all wrote grants, and so had grants from the Department of Justice and other groups. Eventually, Monsanto bought a large chunk of the company and moved the company to use the technology to profile genetically modified crops.
Wow.
But composite, so in graduate school, and even at GeneTrace, I started doing a lot of work in an area that would now be called bioinformatics, which was then it was primarily working on an algorithm called BLAST, looking at public genomic databases as well as oftentimes private genomic databases. And I started doing all this work in federated querying, basically querying multiple databases. And after GeneTrace, I started getting more experience, frankly, in the internet. I went to a company that got bought by US Web, and then the founders of US Web started a company called Electron Economy, which I was a part of the founding team there. I was the first engineer, built an engineering team of about 120 people. But key data point here, we closed our Series B in March of 2000. And so for those of you who were in this room during that time, the timing was both the best and the worst because our valuation was very high, yet we had all this money. And long story short, company got up to 220. Half of that was in engineering. By the summer of 2001, I was the last executive. We had laid off 180 people and sold the company because we had $40 million in the bank.
Wow.
That was a humbling experience, to say the least. After that company, Electron Economy, is when I started composite software that is actually still around today and doing very well, looking at how you bring data across vertically partitioned data into one place. They say, what does that actually mean? How do you create a single view of a customer? And frankly, a lot of the initial work that I did there was based on some of the stuff I'd done in graduate school.
And you were there, you were there for a long time. You were there for 4 or 5 years, is that right?
No, 6 years operationally, then I stayed on the board. So this is a company that I had 5 guys out of my house. I financed the company, kind of original ideation. I wrote our original query engine. We did a Series A 10 years ago this last summer. And so, we were one of a handful of companies that got financing. So one of the differences then versus today was certainly I had to give a lot more of my company up for that financing, but I was really grateful to be able to move the company out of our house and actually build a company. I mean, the company is around today, 10 years later, with over 100 employees and doing quite well on the revenue side. Yeah.
And so you start composite. Tell us about can you remember those days very clearly of being in your house, having your team in there? I mean, Kleiner Perkins office is maybe one of the nicest offices I've ever been in my entire life. And can you, when sitting in there, is it easy for you to recall those days of hey, when entrepreneurs come in and talk to you? I mean, how hard is it?
Actually, it is. I mean, I think a couple comments. One, it was both very liberating and fun.
Yeah.
But it was also really, tough as hell. I think it's oftentimes people forget, and I'm sure people in this room don't forget, but starting a company is hard.
Yeah.
I remember.
And feel free to use the word grind in any of the way you're talking.
Okay. We had to grind it out.
Yeah, perfect. Did we get that?
But I mean, I had these 5 guys, 3 of which are still at the company 10 years later, which is awesome, who were working on my house. They just kind of trusted that I was going to go somehow magically close this round of financing. And it was a lot of pressure. So it was like both awesome that like I didn't have to deal with a lot of meetings and BS. I had to deal with fundraising BS. But, it was just it was a lot of fun to go do that. I think one of the things that influences me today is I can remember the amount of time that I spent financing and fundraising with firms where I wouldn't get any feedback. I'm meeting and all of a sudden, like, I wouldn't hear anything again. I mean, like, okay, that really sucks. Like, I'm a big boy. Like, you can tell me no.
Right.
It'd be really awesome if you tell me no and, like, why. But, like, this other model of disrespect is not cool because I know how hard it is. And I think the motivation also to go start a company tends to be, I think, in general, very pure for the companies that work.
Yeah.
Like, you don't go start a company to go make money. Like, that will not play out well. And so when I look back on that, I look at it very positive, but I'm actually more proud of what the team collectively did to go build a company and be able to hire those, hundreds of people and actually they create a business, and maybe it's not the $10 billion business, but it's a business.
Yeah. And is that something that you apply today as a venture capitalist? Or you,
yeah,
are you very honest in your feedback?
It's one of the reasons why I actually got into venture capital. So I closed the Series A and it was a little bit north of $5 million, which is awesome. I was the CEO, built a management team. I had no idea how to build a management team. And the reason why that's relevant is the two primary investors were and are great people, but they're more financiers than necessarily company builders. And actually, an angel, that wasn't really an angel investor, a small investor in that Series A, because we didn't have any angel investors, was a professor named Rajiv Motwani. And Rajiv, who unfortunately has passed away, provided a really kind of key link between Stanford and the startup community. Okay, he was Sergey Brin's advisor, just a kind of a key link. I met Rajiv because 3 different firms asked him to do technical due diligence on the company. It happened that what we were building was exactly the research he was doing at Stanford, so he invested. But coming back to why he was so influential and why he actually is one of the reasons why I'm in venture capital is, I think as a technologist and as someone who was very close to startups, I got so much great counsel and mentoring from him on how to either hire or build a company, and I felt like it was really balanced.
Yeah.
That I was like, wow, like that's really helpful help, because I think there's examples that I saw of we'll call it like bad help that sometimes investors will provide, where I think they mean well, but unless you've kind of been there or done, it's like you're not.
So give us an example of that.
Well, I'll give you a very specific example that I wish I would have gotten more help on, and that was hiring a VP of sales. Okay, as an engineer, I had no idea how to hire a VP of sales. Okay, Rajiv gave me some advice that was helpful. I asked the investors as well, but like I just wish that there was someone that could have paired with me a little bit more to do that. And at the end of the day, I mean,
so is that no advice, or are you saying that like people that they didn't really have great expertise in that, they're giving you advice, but it wasn't good advice?
Well, I think actually the VP of sales in that case was a tough one, because I did get advice from both the investors and Rajiv as well, and it was helpful. But I think what is more helpful to me as an entrepreneur, what I would have loved is to have someone on my board or an investor who had been there who said, hey, you know what? I know that you're going to probably gravitate more to this type of person, because as an engineer, you're more unlikely going to want to hire this type of person.
Right.
So I'll give you an example, a very specific one. So there's kind of 2 categories in sales, I think, at a macro level that I've been coached on. One are kind of a group of hunters and a group of farmers. Okay. So farmers are really good traditionally in areas like partnerships and business development, kind of relationship building. Where in the other category of hunters, these are coin-operated sales machines. They are awesome when you know what your product is, and they will go out and sell it.
Yeah.
Right? And I can tell you from my own experience, like I kind of like hanging out with the farmer more so than the hunter.
Yeah.
And but it's also tough as a startup, because a lot of time you need that farmer to get going, but then you have to transition into the hunter. And I had to learn that the hard way. I mean, I had to remove someone who I'd hired for that farmer role. I'm still good friends with him. But, that I'm sure could have been handled smoother.
Yeah. Well, that's part of this whole strategic shift in venture capital too, right? There's all these firms there's one firm here in the Valley that has dozens of people that support their startups in marketing, right? And I don't think we've seen that previously, right? Is it that type of thing where you're actually literally supporting and hiring?
Well, I think there's support, but you've got to make sure the company can develop its own muscles, right? So, even in the case of composite, you have a board meeting every 6 or 8 weeks. You have someone that's like flying in, maybe you're talking to them in between, but day to day, like you're running your company. And so I think ideally, and this is what I'm trying to do with the companies I'm involved with, is ask the right questions and encourage entrepreneurs and founders and CEOs just to think through the implications versus saying, here's how to go do this. I may share an experience, but it may or may not apply.
Yeah. So let's talk about, so you found Composite. You also found another company called Passenger, right? And we can talk about it if you'd like. And then a couple years later, you end up at Microsoft as a very senior executive, building an
like the reverse
team.
Thing what most people do.
Yeah. So tell us, why did you make that decision to leave being an entrepreneur and to kind of take this role at Microsoft?
So this is in kind of 2006. And actually at the time, Rajiv was having me look at a number of investments with him and advise. And I was really stuck on wanting to work on cloud computing. Okay. And I felt like I could do that at 2 places. I could do that at Google, or I could do that at Microsoft. While I was at Composite, I did a lot of our initial sales, which were into a lot of the large financial institutions. So JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley. And what I saw were a lot of those guys, 7, 8 years ago, were frankly running their own clouds, and doing their own infrastructure. And I saw Microsoft there, but I did not see Google. And kind of at that same time, I kept saying no to Microsoft, but I ended up agreeing to join up as a IC. So I went up as an engineer. I worked for one of their 12 technical fellows and helped write their app fabric or their DHT for Azure. Part of it was I just wanted to go back to writing software, but I wanted to do that at larger scale.
Yep. And talk to us about transitioning there. You were there for several years.
Yeah.
And then tell how did you moving down here and moving into Palm and WebOS, how did that happen?
That was a massive shift for me.
Yeah, seriously.
Because there was kind of a set of family things that had me come back. But when I came back, a friend of mine had been recruited by Elevation Partners to rebuild the management team at Palm. So, quick history. In the fall of 2007 or so, Elevation Partners put in $325 million into Palm to rebuild Palm, to relaunch Palm. And John Rubinstein joined. John was the originator of the iPod under Steve. He brought over Mike Bell to run hardware. And after spending time with John and Roger McNamee, I decided to go lead software. I can tell you I had no real clarity on what my role was going to entail. But what I did feel really pretty intriguing was not only the rise of mobile, but bringing in kind of cloud, a very different orientation to mobile from a cloud computing perspective that I didn't feel like traditionally had always been the case in mobile.
Yeah. Who in here owned a Palm Pre? I did. Yeah. The Trio, which you didn't work on, but is still, the brand loyalty of Palm users was incredible.
No, look, very, very proud of what the team did with WebOS.
Yeah.
So it was WebOS was what the team designed and shipped. And I think the team did an awesome job. But I think it also is a great example of doing, 1.0 software. That entire OS was effectively written in less than a year. Most people don't know that.
Wow.
A month after I joined, we reset it entirely. Okay. And then the hardware was 1.0. And you had a 1.0 entirely new team. So, there's a lot of uphill challenges. You can look back and go hey, there was never a chance in hell. But I actually think that, barring, the rise of Android and some of these others, I think it was, I'm very proud of the product that we shipped with WebOS. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, what those challenges, do you feel like that was the biggest challenge, that the software, you had to come in and start from scratch? Was it that the engineering team, you had to come in and build that? What was
I think the number one challenge for me, I don't think I had realized how fortunate you are when you're an entrepreneur. You get to pick everyone you work with. Okay. Everyone you hire, you kind of have to, you're responsible for that. If they're a bad hire, you have to eliminate them. If they're a good hire, good for you. Right. And I was very fortunate at Microsoft just because I was working with, the top 20 technical people in the company. There were not a lot, but there were some people at Palm who had been there for a while, and the company hadn't shipped anything for a while. Well, getting someone to ship something in 10 months when they've been comfortable not shipping something for a couple of years, there's a little bit of an impedance.
Super
mismatch,
easy.
Right? And so I had never had to go, okay, and I couldn't necessarily remove everybody at once, and that wasn't the case. There were a lot of great engineers there. But how you can get a C player to operate as a B player, and how do you work with that team was a humbling experience, and the team did an awesome job.
Yeah. So you're at Palm through 2010, and then you moved to Twitter, and this is kind of going to move into us talking about hiring and some of these things that I think are just incredibly current and relevant right now. But talk to us about how difficult was it for you to eventually leave WebOS and to leave what you had built there, and
well, I think it's Composite was a humbling experience too when you're going to leave your child. Right? I stayed operationally involved in 2006. I stayed on the board until Microsoft asked me to leave the board because it was just too close to some of the stuff I was doing there. And that was hard. And I still stayed close because I was the first engineer to leave Composite. In the same way with WebOS. I mean, there's a lot of people there that I recruited into the company directly. But it was apparent that, a lot of these same people that I brought in were not necessarily people that would apply for jobs at HP, to be frank. Okay, these were, we recruited like 6 different technical co-founders of companies, right? 2 from their own companies. They were not through acquisitions, right? Awesome team. But also you look at what the situation was after our launch, and like that wasn't going to necessarily play out. So I think people understood that, but it wasn't easy. I would never pretend that, because I think there's a deep responsibility to that. But part of your kind of responsibility, I think, as a leader is also putting your team in a situation where they're not as dependent on you, and you're kind of putting yourself out of a job. And I think that's just an important thing to do.
Talk about that a little bit. When you say putting yourself out of a job, like you hire such good people that they manage.
They just take over. I mean, in the case of Composite, like I didn't run engineering. I was originally I was like the engineer at night and the CEO by day. I hired a CEO. I hired a public CEO to be the CEO. He's still the CEO today. It was not forced on me by the investors. I became the CTO. And part of me wanted to do a lot more, frankly, writing software. But what I really actually had to do for the company's sake was sell.
Yeah.
I did probably our first 15 or 20 million in sales. And that's like start to finish. And I think it's just about when you're a founder or you have a leadership role, you have to figure out what's the right thing to do for the team, and putting that really first.
So you come into Twitter. Twitter's got about 75
something like that.
75 engineers. You then grow that team to more than 350. Let's talk about this a little bit, because I know there are people in this room that, like, including myself, that have had at times had a horrible time hiring one engineer, let alone 300. So like where do you even begin? I mean,
a lot of coffee.
Okay.
And GitHub trolling and LinkedIn. I can expand on those. So
yeah, let's start right at the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think, there was probably 2 things that were one of the, at least aspects engineering wise with Twitter at the time. One was a real underinvestment in people, just in hiring enough people. There were just too many people that had to firefight 24/7, had to be heroes, and that is brutal to go through. And then the other was just a real underinvestment in infrastructure. Okay, so kind of on both of those dimensions, there was massive change. In the case of on the people side, we had great people, we just needed more people.
Yeah.
And so how do you actually do that? Well, I don't necessarily know if there's a secret piece, but I'll tell you a couple of things we didn't do. So especially because when I joined, I mean, it wasn't like Twitter was a place for like all engineers wanted to flock to. I mean, the site was down a lot. And so I was like, well, those guys don't care. And it actually turned out it wasn't that people didn't care. People actually cared a lot, but it's just, grossly understaffed. One of the things that I think a lot of startups I see even today do is they hire a set of recruiters, and then they trust that those recruiters will take care of all these hiring problems for them. Okay. Now, this isn't a comment that recruiters are not needed. Recruiters are great, but recruiters are not the panacea for hiring engineers. The best person to go recruit an engineer is another engineer, oftentimes the founder or the VP of engineering. So a lot of the closing, I should say, I focused on it at Twitter. And I don't know what the specific number is, but I would say probably at least 80%. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's one. The second is
an engineer. That one thing is that an engineer needs to close an engineer.
Yeah, I really do. And I think an engineer pulls an engineer out of a company. I mean, look, in this day, any great engineer is very gainfully employed, right?
Yeah.
It's unlikely they're looking. So let's look at 2 different email scenarios. You get an email from, Joey recruiter, Right? Hey, maybe they spelled your name wrong or right. It's like
a lot of caps.
Right?
A lot
We've
of
all
caps.
seen this, right? Yeah. Best job ever. Or you get email, from the woman engineer saying, hey, I'm working on some really great projects. Like, let's go grab a coffee. I think that in those two scenarios, most people are like, I'll listen. This sounds interesting, like interesting problems. So, like, we actually did an exercise where we just audited, like, what are the interesting problems that we're working on? And then let's go actually reach out to people that we think might find interest of working on those problems. Because you think you step back, you're like, what does an engineer really want? I want to work on tough problems.
Yeah.
I want to work around great engineers, and I want them to have an impact around that. You get those three things, everything else kind of falls in place. And yeah, your comp has to be in range and things like that. But I can tell you, it wasn't like our comp packages were, commensurate with the Goog here. I mean, this place does very well, and they pay very well.
Sure.
Okay?
And we thank them for hosting us tonight.
Yeah.
Google Ventures, at Google Ventures.
And I'm not trying to trivialize that. It is hard to go hire engineers, but I think it really, you have to take ownership.
Yeah.
And so, what we would do is we would do a lot of internal referrals. I mean, a large percentage of that hires were internal referrals. And you go, how do you do that? Well, one failure mode might be a company, you hire, Matt the engineer, and he starts, and you sit him down, and you go, okay, who do you know? Like, oh, yeah, I know this guy at LinkedIn, I know this guy at GitHub or whatever.
Is this you? Is this literally you sitting in a room with him whiteboarding names, or is this?
Well, initially, it may have been me. But
yeah. As the team grew,
scale, and so we kind of grew this out. But the key here is you do that conversation, and I can tell you keep in mind, it's Matt's first day.
Right.
The last thing he's thinking about is like the guy he worked with.
Getting his buddies over.
Two companies ago.
Yeah.
And so how do you do this on a recurring basis?
Huh.
And this is something that we really tried to focus on. Like, how do you, in a recurring way, make a competition? How many names can you get on a board from LinkedIn? How many names can you get on from GitHub? And then, especially like if they're on certain open source projects, how do we think through who's the right person to go reach out to that engineer? Now,
and is the right person a connection? Is it somebody that's
kind of depends.
An expert in his?
It could be someone who knows.
Yeah.
I mean, that first reach out, the win is just getting that coffee.
Yeah.
And the other recommendation I would do is to not do that meeting at your office. And you go, well, why would you do that? There's something about making it more informal that people are more willing to go do.
That's really interesting.
And this is particularly important for very senior hires.
Yeah.
Now, I say this at the same time saying it's not that you don't need recruiters. Recruiters are very helpful to fill the top part of that pipeline and help manage this process. So it's a good experience for the candidate, and it gives the candidate another person for he or she to talk to, especially when you're negotiating or you're competing with other companies, which is oftentimes the case. But you want to know who you're competing with.
Can I just ask you just a few nuances about that meeting outside of the office? Is coffee better than lunch? Is you paying better than him paying? I
think you should always pay. I mean, they're doing you a favor. At least that's what I look at. It's like, if you gave me an hour of your time, like, I really appreciate that. I would do coffee because, like, I don't know, lunch seems like a set amount of time. It seems like a long period of time. Yeah. Because like if it's not a good connection, then you should move on.
Yeah.
But I think things like, this is what I would do. I did these same things at Composite. So you have to remember, my career is I've always had to hire uphill, like in the sense that it wasn't like, I had joined Google and Google was public and then you could hire at Google. Like that's easy when you have momentum, right? I'd say probably the last third or so of my time at Twitter, we had momentum and it was easier, and then it just became more difficult on the senior side. But with most of the companies that you're involved with, or like I've experienced with, it's hard. You're selling yourself. You're selling the experience.
Yeah.
You're not, you may be selling the vision and the equity in your company, but I just think that you just have to think through, like, what would you want to go experience?
Yeah. And what can you, some of the questions that you would ask, like how hard do you pitch in that initial meeting? Are you, how hard are you selling?
Certainly, most of the time at Twitter, I was closing more than at the beginning.
Sure.
But I think one of the questions I'd ask, and I think I shared this with you, is, what do you want to do after Twitter? People go, huh? Like, no, like, what do you want to do after Twitter? Like, I want to go start a company. Like, okay. So let me walk through with you different things or experiences that you might be able to do here at Twitter to learn to go increase your probability of succeeding when you go do that. And I always found that a really helpful exercise. And I think it helped the candidate too, because then it's like, and it's not that I want that person to go join Twitter and then leave, immediately. But let's face it, like everyone's going to go leave. And like I've told every team I've ever led, like the strength of this valley is like the people in this room. I mean, it's the network. It's not any particular company.
What are some of the best practices for testing technical, technical ability? What do you have specific things that you do? Do you just look at?
I think every engineer's got their own like favorite questions, but let me answer that a little bit differently. Sure. I think one is you want to make sure that your interview process is very, very difficult. And you go, oh yeah, of course. But I actually mean that really serious, because if it's easy or perceived as easy by an engineer, he or she will not want to join your company, because they'll go, wait a second, if this is the interview, then everyone that's here, I don't know if they're the caliber of engineer that I actually want to work with. And so that's one comment. The second is, it is worthwhile coming up with a list of questions that you collectively want to use as a company to actually go interview. And the reason why you want to do that is not everyone has as much experience interviewing as other people. So like in our case, to do that type of growth, you do like the quick numbers. You go, okay, if you hired 300, and on average, let's say you talk to 30 people for every person you hire and close, that's 900 people. That's a lot of interviews. And, we had a lot of folks who had never done that many interviews. And so how do you train people to interview? Is it is it we did pair interviews and at least having the common list of questions, you kind of ensure that there was a degree of consistency. A, so the same question wasn't asked to every candidate. And then B, how do you actually train up people to go hire? That was something that, probably still do a better job at, but it was something we thought about.
I mean, and just to bring it down to this level of two guys in a garage, which we are, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room are, to even at this point, to find 30 great engineers or good, for me to get those 30 interviews, that might take me. I mean, I've done this. It probably took me 4 months to talk to 30 engineers or something. I mean, that's I don't know if that's fast or slow. I'm just throwing out a number. Yeah. But so if I meet an engineer who seems pretty competent and I'm startup of 1 or 2 guys, I mean, you tell me, shouldn't I just be like, I got to just hire this guy, make the interview process easy. Let's get this, let's get this going. Or,
well, I mean, but I think there's a lot of considerations when you're under 10 people. So, you always want to get the best engineer. Okay. It's easy for me to stand up here and go, make them really hard. Let's go back to data structures 101 and, see how strong that they're actually there. But there are also other nuances that you have to make too around culture. I mean, as a percentage, when you're 2 people, I mean, every person is such a large percentage. And I would argue that most cultures and companies are set after probably the 10th employee. Huh. And then you can maybe very slightly change those, but for the most part, you're pretty set in terms of, is this an engineering-centric company or design-centric or product, where you sit kind of in that area of gravity. So you think you have to be thoughtful about that. So it's not a comment saying lower your bar, but I think you have to think about who you're hiring for. So I'll give you an example. So, you can find, I think, great self-taught computer scientists that maybe are not far along in their career, but are so ambitious, are willing to sacrifice so much to go help you get your company going. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And, maybe they didn't do the best on, the bubble sort problem or whatever, but you're willing to take that bet. And I think you have to, I think you have to have a balance, and you have to be pragmatic about it too.
Yeah. Or maybe they didn't go to Stanford. They didn't get a CS degree from Stanford.
I think that's fine.
Yeah.
I think there's plenty of great, smart people that did not go to CS at Stanford.
Yeah, fair enough. So I finally convinced this guy to join me. Hallelujah, angels are singing. Mm-hmm. How do I keep this guy engaged? How do I get him? He's still getting all these meetings for coffee, or people that are trying to hit him up every single day.
Make sure he's really busy with work.
Just load him full of work.
We're in a free agency.
Harder.
Right? I mean, no. I mean, but look, there are a lot of opportunities, and I think it puts a lot of onus and challenge on the people in this room to create an environment where people want to go work with you on the journey and exploration that you're on. I think speaking for myself, I look back at Composite, you asked me what do I look back in those fond memories? It's the journey. Right? It wasn't like there was some end game of when we hit this point, we're done. Awesome. And I think and it's hard, and there's times where there's ups and there's downs, and many of you probably seen this. I think that's why people ultimately go up and end up and stay. And, one of the challenges when you get that first employee and you start growing and that pond is grows, right? So they're used to being a big fish in a small pond. The pond's growing. They're like, wait a second, I'm a small fish. That's a tough time for a company to go through. I saw, probably during my time at Twitter, I saw it maybe like 6 times. Because there's like these funny different step functions where companies go through, where it's just kind of this compression or expansion, where you go, oh, like this is awkward. And, because a lot of times at the early part of a company's history, you're hiring a lot of generalists because you just kind of need everyone to do everything. And then you end up with typically more specialists over time. Not always, but in certain domains, certainly.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about acqui-hires. Is that something in terms of your experience? Is that, with all the acqui-hires you've been a part of, or the people that you've seen over these, these companies you've been a part of, what is your takeaway? Is it a good decision to do that? Is it better to just bring people in and train them
from a company or the
culture company?
Well, I mean, so we
retention.
certainly did a number of these at Twitter, and I think they can work as long as the team's really small, and ideally that the team physically co-locates wherever the mothership is.
Yeah. And small being how big? What do you mean by
probably 5
small?
or less.
Okay.
Honestly, I think you can maybe stretch it to 7, but it just gets hard. And just because to get that group assimilated into the other culture, and you kind of have to over time slowly tease that group of 5 apart, because you really want them a part of the collective larger team than that smaller team. I'm sure that if you talk to a number of those acqui-hires, there'd be a certain set of companies that was a complete disaster, and there's another set that said, hey, it was awesome. And there's not a magic. I think one of the things from the acquirer side that we oftentimes look at is, what's the motivation behind the people that are in the company? Like, why are they there? Are they really deep and focused on building this one product? I mean, the worst thing is when someone tells you what they want to hear, like, yes, I really do want to go work on that product, but I secretly want to finish this other one over here that I didn't finish at my startup that didn't work out, right? And that, that can happen, and that's something that is important, I think, for both sides that really sets out, because that will never end up well.
So I'm a founder. I hire, this guy. I think he's going to be amazing. We get started. It's great. Month in, I realize, oh my gosh, this guy is no good. Like, this is not working. What do I do? How do I get rid of somebody? How do I fire somebody?
I think what you first do is you have a conversation with him and you give him that feedback.
Yeah.
And you're really clear in the expectations of, hey, thought it was this and you deliver this. And there's 2 reasons to do this. One is just to be really clear with the person, your expectations. You don't know if maybe that person's got something going on outside of work. You don't know.
Yeah.
But it's really important, I think, to be really clear and direct. And then it's also important legally that you've documented that you've had that discussion. I would not wait a long period of time for that person to go correct behavior after that. But I think it's important as much as you can to not surprise the person if you eliminate them.
Yeah.
Oftentimes most people may still feel surprised, even if you've had that conversation, human nature. But I just think being kind of as direct as you can to give that person an opportunity to go correct that.
Yeah. And a long time being how long in your book?
2 weeks, 3 weeks max.
And when is it if they work through it? I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience literally dozens of times. So, typically if there is an issue, is it, you have this period of 2 or 3 weeks, you reassess, and then...
Here's what normally happens.
Yeah.
There are two paths that get pretty evident the first couple of days. Either a person goes, oh, shit, like, I'm going to get my act together, and it's immediately resolved, and the person is higher in delivery than they were before, or the person goes and resigns because they don't want to deal with getting exited. And then there's maybe like a third category, which are just still not necessarily hearing, or they're not listening to the feedback.
Yep. Okay. So I want to talk quickly about you being at Kleiner Perkins, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Talk to us a little bit about that move. Now you go from entrepreneur, you go to Microsoft, Palm, Twitter, and then into Kleiner. What went into that decision, and specifically Kleiner?
So, I mean, for me, this is like a little bit of a test to see how I can scale myself to help engineers and designers just go start companies. And I mean that very sincerely. I mean, we are in the service business. You can make an argument that the capital part of it's probably the most commoditized part of venture capital. And so my motivation is like genuinely to go, frankly, do full time what I was starting to do 4 or 5 years ago, which I was doing a bunch of advisory work, a bunch of angel work. And if I can go give and share some of these experiences back, like that's awesome. Unlike an operating role, the feedback in my role is very different. It takes years, so I won't know for quite a while, how good I'm at this. But I just passed my first year and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Would you back a non-technical founder?
I think if they were not paired
with a technical guy,
then I probably wouldn't.
Yeah,
because I just would fall out of my area of focus.
Yeah.
Which I totally realize there's like certain types of companies that like I probably just won't back, and that's okay.
Yeah.
There's plenty of other investors.
And for entrepreneurs, I mean, that's okay too, right? It's quick, it's simple. It's, hey, he's not the right guy to invest in you, or he is, right? It's one of those gates. Talk to us about being at Kleiner and kind of Kleiner Perkins has been in the news over the last 6 months. Talk to us about what this last year has been like for you being there, and then what is in store for the Kleiner Perkins brand and investments here over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I didn't answer your question about why. So one of the things that really impressed me with Kleiner Perkins, and I saw this when Kleiner Perkins invested in the Twitter, was that the partnership really operates like a partnership, meaning different partners work together on certain companies to help them succeed or get built. Whether it be my partner Ben Gordon, who is the founder of EA, to other partners, we have basically a number of folks who started companies, different scale, different size. So we're all kind of this set of company builders. I mean, effectively, I think that's really cool, and that's fun to be around a really eclectic group of people. We have, I think, really interesting high bandwidth discussions. Certainly, the firm has been in the news a bunch. I can't comment on that. That predates me. But what I do think is going on in venture capital is this kind of, we'll call it return, frankly, to what venture capital really was about when it started in the 50s, which was about getting capital to groups of engineers to drive innovation. And part of, I think, our responsibility, my responsibility at Kleiner Perkins, is to figure out how I can give advantages to those entrepreneurs, right? So whether that be in recruiting, so not just giving advice, but maybe even help close, which I've done, and I do that for not just the companies I'm involved with across the portfolio, or on partnerships. So we're a firm that is fortunate to have board members of Amazon, Google, Apple, and so there's a lot of things that, and as well as additional relationships in those companies besides the board membership, that we can use to help our portfolio companies. And so that's, I think Kleiner Perkins has been around for 40 years. This year's 40th anniversary. And I think for a period of time, the firm also did not focus as much on digital as the firm did on green tech. And if you just look at the focus and the number of partners at the firm today, we're not just back. I'd say we're even more focused than we ever were on digital. My partner, Mary Meeker, put out an updated version of her Internet Trends report.
Who read that? Raise a hand.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So if you haven't, it's really worth looking at. I mean, it as I was mentioning to someone earlier, it's just data, right? There's not making any huge bold predictions. It's just saying, here's the data. And you start looking at the data, and in particular where we are in mobile, and it's very clear that we're very early, right? We're very early on just adoption globally of smartphones. We're very, very early on the kind of mobile monetization. You're still looking at the amount of advertising dollars going into TV versus times watched versus dollars going into mobile content. I mean, there's these huge gaps. And so, I think we just feel like it's just really early. And so, we do investments both on the enterprise and the consumer side, and I'm kind of the oddball GP that does both.
Talk to us just, and if you want to ask a question, just come right up here and line up right kind of where Nathan is sitting right there, and we'll turn some time over to you. We've had guys like Sahil from Gumroad, who you sit on the, whose company you sit on the board of, Gumroad. Tell us about, what have you seen in a guy like him or the guys at Code Academy? Now, that water's brought to you by Greenberg Traurig. Just putting it out there. I mean, it's good. It's good. It's good. It's awesome. Yeah, great. You can make some sounds, some kind of grind your teeth or something. So tell us, what have you seen in those guys, as young as they are, And actually, I think the Code Academy guys made the 30 under 30 Forbes today or yesterday.
I saw Zach in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So
congrats, Zach.
Yeah. What do you what have you seen in those guys? Why, out of the 1,000 pitches that you get or have seen, how did they make it through? What did they do?
Yeah. One of my filters, if you will, is when I meet a company, I look at the company and the founder and say, like, would I want to go work there? And would I want to go work with this person? And would that be fun? That's kind of my first metric. And, Sahil I met before he was fundraising. He was never actually really fundraising. I had to convince him to fundraise. And I met this guy, and I clearly could see just that he has a very unique talent. And if you meet him, I think you would agree. Part of that's just from all these hiring I've done over the years.
Yeah.
But he's just a really kind of a gifted entrepreneur. And then secondarily, when I saw what he was doing and the network effects of what he was doing, I thought, hey, like, this is a company that it would be a real privilege to be a part of. And, I at one point even offered to do a pair programming project with Sahil to just get to know me better. Because I think, one of the things that sometimes entrepreneurs forget is the relationship with an investor is very long-lived. It's, there's no logical path to go fire an investor. And so, and I think this is important because as you go fundraise, you really want to get to know the investor. And which is why it kind of bothers me at times when you hear about term sheets are like, hey, it's going to expire tomorrow morning at 10. It's like, you really want to get to know these people. Trust me. And it's bi-directional too, right?
Yeah.
So, Sahil and I spent time over 2-3 months, just to get to know each other.
Huh.
Yeah. And I go up there once a week.
Oh, cool. You work out of their office?
Yeah. For 2
Are they in an office? Or are they in an apartment still?
They're in an office.
They're in
a couple
now.
months ago. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this raises this question again, kind of like the engineering question of, well, if I'm looking for an investor, like Sahil, he came out of Pinterest. He checks all these great boxes. He's a very, very talented designer and engineer. So he's one of these guys that probably had lots of options. He could kind of date anybody, it felt like. And, you came in, you got him to get to know you. What if I'm an entrepreneur doesn't have a lot of options? I only have one term sheet, or I only have.
Yeah, so that's a scenario there where it's like the individual leading. I think you can also build a great product.
Yeah.
And come in and have a very similar outcome, right? Yeah, and I do believe that. And you could have data that supports like how popular that product is, but I think that's a very reasonable path. And I heard a really great quote from an entrepreneur on my over here. I was on the phone with him, and he's like, I just love this product I'm building. He's like, I almost feel like I've created the business to build this product. And that type of entrepreneur in my mind is like one that I love to back, because it's just that deep passion for what they're doing. And, obviously that has to be matched to a product that the market demands and all these other different pieces. But you kind of have to start there. And it comes down to like, why are you doing this? And what's that core motivation? That's the common thread, I think, even with both those guys and other entrepreneurs as well that are older. It's what's the kind of deep motivation.
Great. Can we give Mike a big round of applause? Thank him.
Thank you for having me.